From time to time, I venture to cast my mind back to my novitiate days in anthropology, when the choice of road to be taken or not was unfolded in front. To become a sorcerer's apprentice of some great master, in my case a mistress, a disciple of a trendy disciplinary order, or a free-spirited, unleashed student of human conduct. As only the third option seemed to be worth pursuing, I was after a role model to follow, a non-commissioned mentor to look up to, a fellow anthropologist to identify with. That paragon of extraordinary anthropological canon gaze was embodied in young Don, whose excitingly fresh insight and incisive grasp of the games people play, as well as of the fine line between mimicry and mimesis, long before a post-colonial complexion was put to it, were like a wake-up call to a seemingly slumbering discipline at the time. Little did I realize at the time that these building bricks carved out of the quarry of Gregory Bateson, Gregory Stone, and Irving Goffman would be set by Don as the keystones for an artistically crafted arch straddling presentations and representations, cosmology and selfhood, truth and falsehood, bureaucracy and mythology, faces and facades, clowns and kings, sinners and saints, cemeteries and circuses, public extravaganzas and hidden rhythms. In short, the RI logos of the anthropos, the architecture of the absurdity of living. However, underneath that arch of reversible words and topsy-turvy antimonies lies the constitutive leitmotifs of Don's teaching, and presumably the core cause and case for his anthropological concerns. That is the most intricate and intriguing of all concerns, time and time again, linear or cyclical, repetitive or continuous, ephemeral or perennial, subjective or objective, external or internal, still or effervescent, teleological or totalic, non-indigenous or autochthonous, accelerated or suspended, determinable or rescindable, centripetal or centrifugal, all forms and shapes of temporality that vibrantly run through Don's masterly taming of this self-effacing, albeit recalcitrant or robust. As I am complicit in that treacherous quest for the key to the cavern of time, it would seem fit for me to dabble in yet another juggling act of playing with that slippery and mercurial ball. This time, by reflecting on the modus operandi of time in the Sisyphean toil of anthropologists to translate one cultural language into another. This will be sought by pondering over the deep end of that exploit. That is, when translation patently fails. It is suggested then that the occurrence of untranslatability is inherent in the incompatibility and irreconcilability of disparate temporalities. Anthropologically speaking, translation is made improbable when interlocution is rendered inertial, when liminality loses its dynamic potency, and when, to use Paul Stoller's lingo, the transformational power of the between wanes. To turn to Vincent Crapanzano's elaboration of the Moroccan concept of the barzakh, that is the interstice amidst times, once the space between silences dissipates and even the entry into dreamland is banned, no translation could possibly take place. So let's scout this non-place. With your permission, I would like to take the plunge by letting you into an identity predicament in delivering this talk. I've been taken upon myself to speak of the unspeakable, as untranslatability, like unknowability, alludes to a contradiction in terms, namely to contemplate and discuss something beyond the limits of discourse, a point of singularity, a void where sense becomes senseless. And to add insult to injury, I must face this non sequitur via the double bind of belonging to two diametrically opposed worlds at once, the discipline of anthropology and the study of old age. The former necessitates translation as an indispensable means of spanning diverse cultural domains, thereby rendering any kind of otherness somewhat intelligible, while the latter encounters outwardly unintelligible others who arguably desiccate translation altogether. This spells an ambivalent dialectic of the communication imperative on the one hand and the plight of failing to understand the incommunicado on the other. It calls for a tangled attempt at interfacing and interlacing distinct life worlds interweaved with their corresponding cosmologies and temporal orientations. This seldom met challenge of seeking understanding rather than explanation captures the gist of the problem of untranslatability. That is the property of an expression, be it verbal, written, performative, ineffable, embodied, or sensuous, to decline to be mirrored or modeled, to resist making sense in terms of another system of comprehension or extrapolation, to refuse to defile the sacredness of the original text, as Walter Benjamin would have it, and to disclose and obscure it at the same time as Jacques Derrida would deconstruct it. The specter of untranslatability, therefore, haunts any act of translation. Every cultural text alternately interplays a translatable and untranslatable moments of now you see me, now you don't, a hide-and-seek game of the authentic and its mimetic alter ego. However, there seems to be an exception to this oxymoronic rule of translatable untranslatability, and that is the apparent inscrutability of the symbolic category of the old. In a death-repellent society where its elderly appointees are deployed as the buffer zone between the inexorable translatability of life and the willful untranslatability of non-life, they become null and void, and as subject, amenable and accountable for translation. Furthermore, in a culture that sanctifies progress, tempered with the possibility of assumed reversibility, the status of the seemingly unalterable, irrevocable old embodies and invokes both terror and fascination, thus planting the trope of the old in a taboo territory, a heterotopic enclave, to be obdurately shunned, spurned, guarded, and surveilled from within and from without. In that respect, the cultural depiction of the mentally frail old age, especially frail old age, tags a special unexplored murky blot on the landscape of proverbial others, the majority of whom, though, are deemed tameable, domesticated, and thus given to be translatable. Conversely, the unbridled savage old is debatably beyond translation, somehow pre, past, under, and outside the civilized order. It evokes a sense of otherness beyond the articulated reach and grasp of anthropologists' passion and ambition for translation at all cost, even at the expense of losing sight of the source material itself as versed and styled in ethnography. Thus, in the case of accounting for the conduct of and the communication with the old, the anthropologist as a translator would often pick out the option of a suspicion of betraying the authenticity of the field rather than being failingly and painfully faithful to it, to keep allegiance to the college of colleagues rather than to the fellowship forged in the field. The anthropologist is ideally considered an omnipotent translator of others, that whose main preoccupation is with the linguistic metaphorical devices employed to cogently transmute one cultural habitus into another. Why and how, then, such a dialogue could be aborted, and what prevents two discourses from cultivating a shared arena of mutually intelligible symbolic exchange and dyadic interplay. The following sketches a number of possible conditions for being lost in translation, with the danger of untranslatability forever looming on the horizon of anthropological practice, thus sapping the whole of the representational endeavor. The foremost condition is the inability to credibly transfer one set of metaphors into another. Such critical incommensurability might occur when the signifying foundation of two cultural codes reflect unrelated or even non-relatable spatial temporal scopes, and hence set them apart as mutually exclusive epistemic realms, two languages with no common generative grammar. Under such scarce circumstances, the ethnographic liaison is rendered unattainable. In the absence of a modicum of overlapping grounds of joint meaningfulness, even the most virtuoso among anthropological conjurers would not be able to invoke the spirit of a common experience out of nothing. In the absence of a recognizable other, translation loses its obliging or reluctant addressee, and it's thus rendered futile. In other words, where no others are present, a reason for bridging real or imagined gaps between us and them no longer prevails. In fact, both concepts turn to be of no consequence. Such condition of annulling that binary opposition also arise when hybridizing globalism staggers cultural boundaries while invoking visions of the utopian emergence of a cosmopolitan universe, as wished for by some. Subsequently, the notion of otherness is revoked altogether, and the need for translation is deemed dubious, if not superfluous. Contrary to the futuristic global ethics of redundancy of translation, the reality of failing to communicate cross-culturally is glaringly extant in the gap inherent within intergenerational relationships. The splitting force of the cohort lag effect generates cultural autism of sorts, a state of critical misunderstanding across self-conscious generations that cripples any attempt at exchanging and translating historically contingent cultural paradigms. A case for the untranslatability of generations apart rests not only on culturally stipulated linguistic discrepancies, but also on structures of dependence that replicate and engender diverse discourses of foundering conversation between the superordinate and the subordinate, or to use Edward Said's vocabulary in his posthumously published essay on late style regarding the position of the dispossessed old in modern society, the exiling and the exiled. This kind of post-colonial idiom apparently puts the old on a par with other categories of outcast, or as Zygmunt Bauman coined them, wasted lives. Still, this analogy ignores the fact that unlike other politically discarded groups, the old are denied the right to resist, to reverse their fortune, and to be reckoned with not even by supposedly pertinent academic disciplines such as post-colonial anthropology, which nevertheless welcomes into its fold any other category of politically disqualified others. Testimony to this reluctance to adopt the uniqueness of old age as a legitimate and plausible disciplinary mission is the dearth of late life ethnographic accounts. The very few and far between that dare plow such arid fields often imply a denial of the research topic or a strong sense of unease at the ethnographic brinks that they reach when delving into the alleged experience of aging. Denial of the subject matter is, for example, all those ethnographic texts which, following run-of-the-mill stereotypes, reduce old age to welfare topics and social problems. while manuscripts such as that by Lawrence Cohen, No Aging in India, completely do away with the Western concept of culturally distinct aging. The ethnographic distress and confusion of playing anthropology with old age embedded in the grappling with the predicament of managing time in old age and with the ethnographic loss of authority in the authorship of discordant temporalities. Perplexing monograph titles such as The End of Time, Uneasy Ending, Breaking the Watch, Number Our Days, and The Limbo People reflect both. So I just reflect both the prominent place of time and its convolutions in reporting aging alongside the trap that such ethnographic accounts sets for accounting for aging. Desperate to fill the gap between the race for monograph and the lack of ethnography, anthropologists shift from impressionism to expressionism by recourse to armchair methods of autoethnographic or even fictional writing of culture, such as the making up of faint characters that are designated to inhabit and mediate both worlds. As for me, should you wonder, I concede an a priori defeat and indulge in doing anthropology or failed ethnography, including my own, searching to no avail for a point of temporal coupling and departure that might throw into relief the metacultural essence of time, the embracing logic of divergent logics. A deadlocked conversation such as the following could demonstrate that sense of ethnographic distraction and obstruction. Ethnographer: could you tell me your life story? Interviewee: there is nothing to tell, everything is disconnected. Ethnographer: what do you hope for in the future? Interviewee: nothing, the future is over. All my life chapters are empty, all my life. Ethnographer: could you tell me what you mean? Interviewee: just nothing, nothing at all. That noose of emptiness is the only point of juxtaposed temporalities that takes the anthropological draftswoman or draftman back to the ethnographic drawing board, thus rendering otherness otherlessness, beyond charting and delineating, and yet its uncanny presence overshadows any ethnographic encounter with an air of imminent breakdown. Is there a way for anthropological gerontology to bear witness to the hearing of that muffled, authentic sound of so-called deep old age from beyond? I have suggested that that experience looms outside the safe zone of familiar discourse. This can be paralyzing assertion, since it leaves us with no option save for the recognition of our own limits. On the other hand, the potential option of substituting the eager anthropological preoccupation with people problems and images for the unveiled logic inherent in the matchless and unacquainted state of being terminally old could posit the study of that category at the forefront of the intellectual pursuit of sensing the edges of the social, the cultural, the psychological, and ultimately the human frontiers where the untranslatable overrides the translatable. Indeed, deep old age lies further from the presumption of communication, the corrective power of therapy, as well as of prevention. Subsequently, it speaks in a language deemed unworthy of translation, or even dangerously so, for translation turns the far-removed other into a closely menacing stranger. This potentially polluting category is often disparaged by present-day culture and its constructionist devices. thus regarded by many as a form of human obsolescence, ghostly or zombified existence, unfit for modern consumption and academic digestion. In other words, it is a socially reckoned, extra-cultural, non-transformable category at the margins of non-humanness. What are then these translation-resistant, seemingly extra-cultural realities? Can they be recognized and monitored? Are we dealing here with a kind of exclusion which cannot be subject to inclusion by any means, an anthropological blind spot that obscures the unknown by rendering it unknowable? This test could be conventionally phrased in terms of the discourse of boundaries of otherness, that is, which categories are reasoned as acceptable and which are rejected, whose voice is heard and whose voice must be elicited and made be audible. Prevailing winds of post-colonialism, feminism, cosmopolitanism, and globalization have greatly expanded the range of sounds emanating from the recognized and authorized regions of otherness. Illegitimate otherness, however, is that whose voice is mute, not necessarily due to repression and silencing, but rather because the frequencies of its audio transmissions are not attuned to the receptors of the listeners. Inaccessibility to impervious alterity, therefore, signals the advent of respective impregnability of discrepant world categories, and hence inevitable infeasibility of translation. Okay, I think I'll have to skip a bit. Okay. Incommunicable old age is but one example for such mutual impermeability. Anthropologists are well aware of that any ethnographic transaction harbors the seed for its own destruction. Implicit at the core of the ethnographic encounter lies the dreaded yet expected possibility of the staggered feat of striking a port, of reaching an interactional impasse, of grinding the ethnographic move to a halt. I'll jump to the conclusion. In conclusion, when plateaus of divergent otherness are not coalesced and their synchronicity is frayed, the absence of their presence forestalls any suggestion of transition and transformation of any kind. This is where untranslatability becomes ineluctable, and its location, therefore, is at the critical turning point from transformability, transience, and liquidity into stillness, singularity, and quiddity. In other words, it is the Kafkaean metamorphosis of the lived in, the dynamic fluid temporality of us into the deadly flawless and frozen spatiality of them. This spells the incapacity to convert one state of the matter to another, to travel from one time zone to the next, to move from time to time, if possible. And possible it is through the fine arts, music, and the poetics of undisciplined anthropology as such as Don's.
Thank you very much. I was struck by the thought as you were speaking that in the dearth of ethnological studies of old age, which you spoke about, we have to remember Don's first work in Jerusalem.
Work in Bergen.
Yeah. So there's a kind of nice biographical loop that emerged from what you said. Did you want to respond?
Yeah, and a lot of what you said, it seems to me, was caught in the argument, if between yourself and Barbara Meyerhoff back in the early 1980s, late 70s. I think your first book came out around 1977, 79.
My first book was published in 1980.
1980. So this argument in which Barbara Meyerhoff, who was very close to Victor Turner in her thinking, did a study of an old age home, I think in Venice.
So the day center.
Yeah, it was called Number Hour Days, and then she also had a part in making a film on this, which won an Academy Award. But her approach was indeed the communicability, the understandability of the aged. There was really no problem of communication. She and they existed on the same plane of communication. Chaim's work, which actually was a marvelous piece of analytic ethnography, he studied an old age home in England.
Also a daycare
Also a daycare center, sorry. But in which old people created their own world. It was culturally distinct, and the degree to which it could be understood by others, whether ethnographers or other people around that serviced this, that visited, whatever, was a question. And it really raises issues of ontology in a major way. And it comes back to what I said, to what Ruth said, because, and interestingly, that you raise music as a bridge of comprehension. But there is this problem of, so what is, you described a local ontology. Premises, local premises of existence that unenunciated were understood by the people who visited, the old people in that daycare center. Barbara insisted that it was simply a universal ontology which enabled communication between very different kinds of people, although in her case they were all Jews. And perhaps being all Jews, they had a very solid foundation for communication. What you're saying now is really to expand that argument and your position in a global way and raise it as a very serious problem for anthropologists who try to deal with very bad phrasing, who try to relate to old people. Well, old people, I'm old, and I feel it. And communicating with young people in this world, in this digital world, I often feel I'm just fooling myself. I have they cannot understand me, and I certainly don't understand them. I'm an anthropologist. I'm at a loss. I'm at a loss, and my loss is, in a way, it's the loss of an old man, and it's the loss of an old anthropologist.
But does it require an answer?
No, there is no answer.
There is no answer.
There is no answer, but that's also your point.
Yes, but I'm after, my quest is for the embracing logic of all logics. I mean, in spite of that ethnographic bridge, which could not be overcome, there must be a way to find a syntax, some kind of grammar that can explain away, or not away, all kind of cultural idioms and local knowledge, forms of local knowledge. Something behind it. Maybe go back to structuralism, I'm not sure.
But why must there be a way?
Because I've been trained by your institutions to commit myself to intellectual pursuit at all costs. That's all. And otherwise, it's academic death.
Carol, you have a short statement?
Just very quick. I mean, not to forcibly be optimistic. But I just wonder, I am definitely trapped and in stasis of structuralism of different kinds and institutions of different kinds. But it seems to me that if we look at a social surround, then there are potentialities of different ontologies to meet. And not to say it's a moral act, but perhaps it is. Then there are moments, but they're not moments because time is not time. There are points in motion where they meet. And if they are open in Benjamin's sense as hosts for experience, then perhaps then something happens that are potentialities that are unexpected, I think.
Well,
but we have to be able to think in those terms, and I don't think traditional anthropology can do that.
Well, I can only quote myself in one of my previous works from first principles on the University of the Third Age in Cambridge, England. I suggested that these people live in two separate worlds. One world was the world that enables them to communicate with others, with other generations. And this is exactly what we're doing here, for example, in spite of the age differences that you mentioned. And the other world is an internal world, known only to themselves as elderly people, that we cannot, that other non-elderly people cannot possibly share. It has its own grammar, it has its own significations, it has its own meanings, and we are barred from approaching it. And the separation, the split between the two, enables them to survive. Any spillage, any overflowing between the two is dangerous.
So, I'm going to tell you a secret, which is that, actually I don't believe that there is such a thing as time, but I have been commissioned this morning to watch the clock. I think, first I want to thank all the four speakers.